leave a like and subscribe.
The Double R, lost money. The firm was finally Ronnie's private army. Fort Valence was stocked up with arms. Nothing else mattered now except the little wars. The colonel was convinced that he would soon rule London through the rattle of machine guns and the blood of rivals flowing in the streets. He was quite happy. Reggie was safe behind bars. No women could reach him there. Charlie did not worry him. No one interfered with the strange war game he was playing. As he gathered information, planned his next moves, and prepared to lead his fighting men to battle. He lived at home with Violet and had all he needed. Life would have continued from one battle to the next, but for what happened that autumn. Ronnie met Peter Rackman. Rackman was not notorious yet as the extortionate West London landlord making his unsavory fortune from his rack-rented tenants. But he was thick with money and was vulnerable. This made him interesting to Ronnie, who had heard about him in Paddington. He tried to meet him. Rackman avoided him, but finally, through Dickie Morgan, who worked for Rackman, Ronnie and several friends gatecrashed a party Rackman was giving at the Old Latin Quarter Club in Soho. It was a memorable occasion. Rackman had begun the evening in high spirits. Everyone was laughing at his table. When Ronnie entered, Rackman and the girls tried to ignore him. Ronnie and his friends wore dinner jackets, sat at a table and simply stared at Rackman. None of them spoke or drank. Slowly the conversation died. When Peter Rackman went downstairs, there was a scuffle by the door. Several Kray men joined in. Ronnie Kray yawned, said nothing and waited as the sound of fighting came up the stairs. Then Dickie Morgan came up to him, grinning, and whispered in his ear. Ronnie nodded and stumped from the room. Downstairs a Rolls was waiting, Rackman at the wheel. As Ronnie came from the club, Rackman opened the door and asked where he was going. Valence Road, he grunted and heaved himself in beside Rackman. He had his meeting. There were no polite preliminaries as the colonel delivered his terms, £5,000 immediately, otherwise his men would be in Notting Hill every night of the week and drive Rackman's Renton forces off the streets. Rackman should know that he could put him out of business in a month. At Valence Road, Rackman was invited in to meet Violet and afterwards to discuss things over tea in the upstairs sitting room. Rackman had considerable charm, thanked Violet for the tea, called Ronnie by his first name and made no difficulties when his host demanded an initial down payment. He had £250 on him in cash and wrote a cheque for £1,000. They parted on good terms. Next morning the cheque bounced. When Ronnie heard, he drew a Luger from the armoury and went in search of Rackman. He had vanished. Trouble began in Notting Hill exactly as the colonel prophesied. Rackman's rent collectors were methodically beaten up. Rackman's whole empire, which depended on intimidation of tenants, faced its one real time of crisis. For Peter Rackman had made the mistake of underestimating Ronnie, thinking that he would never have the skill or organization to upset his business. Now that Ronnie proved he had, something needed to be done. Rackman was a clever man. One thing he knew about was intimidation, and he knew that the more he tried to buy off Ronnie Kray, the more he would have to pay later. Much money was at stake, rich influential people's money as well as his own. He had no intention of risking it for Ronnie Kray. What he needed was something big to offer Ronnie as a final payment that would divert him from Notting Hill for good. Someone suggested Esmeralda's barn. On a fine autumn evening in 1960, a man called Stefan de Fay walked along Kensington Gore for an appointment with a retired naval commander at an address behind the Royal Albert Hall. De Fay was a tall, excitable man and was in something of a state. He knew that in the next hour or so he would have to make one of the most uncomfortable decisions of his life. He was a club owner, moderately rich, entirely honest and extremely smart. In his youth, he had written a book entitled Profitable Bar Management, and recently he had secured control of the most promising gaming club in London. It was the sort of chance that comes once in a lifetime. Being shrewd, Stefan de Fay had done his best to keep it to himself. Not too successfully. Something had leaked out. There had been threats. Finally, an invitation came from a certain ex-naval commander. De Fay knew all about him. He was a front man for a number of figures in the underworld. If he refused his invitation, there would be less polite approaches later. Had De Fay been a gangster or a gambler, he might have risked this. As he was neither, he continued walking down Kensington Gore until he found the address he wanted. He rang the bell. The commander, a smiling gentleman with bright false teeth, answered the door and led De Fay into a long brown sitting room. 3 men were waiting. "Mr. De Fay," said the commander, "my good friend, Leslie Payne." A big man rose and shook hands. "And these are the Kray twins, Reginald and Ronald. You'll find them very useful friends to have." Introductions made, the commander departed. Business started. The twins both smoked and remained silent. The man called Payne did the talking, softly and with a hesitant, apologetic charm. It was as if he hated having to tell De Fay how much he knew. He was extremely accurate. He had the whole story of his club, called Esmeralda's Barn. It was in Wilton Place, and had enjoyed a period of success as a nightclub for the bright young things of the early 50s. Cy Grant was among the performers, the young Duke of Kent among the guests. What a waste to let a place like this go to seed. How very smart of Mr. De Fay and his friends to see its possibilities now that the Gaming Act was law. The club looked very good, and with roulette and 4 chemi tables in operation, they should be making lots of money. The big man paused, then named a figure so near the mark that De Fay could only nod in agreement. This was not all that Payne knew about the place. Somehow he had gleaned details of the unusual company structure controlling it. He knew that there were 4 principal shareholders drawing profits from the gambling. He also knew the fact that caused Mr. De Fay so much concern, that Esmeralda's Barn was controlled in turn by a holding company called Hotel Organisation Limited, and that Hotel Organisation had one effective shareholder, Stefan De Fay. As Payne explained this, both twins smiled. Payne's proposition was eminently reasonable. He had heard that Mr. De Fay was no great gambler. Why not exchange his vulnerable position for hard cash? In the long run, it would save a lot of worry. Payne was offering £1,000 down. The sale could take place at once with a simple entry in the company minutes. It would be perfectly legal and would not affect De Fay and the 2 other directors, who could keep their directorships and profits from the barn. Once De Fay relinquished his control, he would be surprised what a weight would be off his mind. If he decided not to, Leslie Payne made no reply but looked towards the twins. Stefan De Fay decided to take his £1,000. Leslie Payne is a key figure at this point in the rise of the twins, and it was natural for Ronnie to go to him for advice when Rackman offered the information about Stefan De Fay's controlling interest in Esmeralda's Barn. Reggie had only just come out of Wandsworth on bail after 9 months of his sentence. Thanks to the skill of his lawyers and a dispute about the evidence on which he had been convicted, his case had been reopened. In the meantime, he was a free man. While he had been away, Payne had become Ronnie's own personal advisor, fixer, frontman, and father figure. When Ronnie put his faith in anyone, the trust was total while it lasted. Health, finance, sex life, business, law, whatever Ronnie's problem and whatever time of day or night, Checker Berry would be sent off in Ronnie's car, and Leslie Payne, the omniscient man with the briefcase, brought back to Valence Road to confer. And yet in many ways, Payne was a most unlikely man to have been mixed up with the Krays, a cultured, humorous man with a sharp brain, a very pretty wife and 2 small daughters, all living cozily in a house in Dulwich. But Les Payne and the twins saw something that they thought they needed in each other. At that time, Payne was a bankrupt and had watched something like 14 of his associated companies float off into liquidation. He could see the twins' potential from the start. For Ronnie, who was often morbidly unsure of himself, Payne had the poise, the confidence, and inside knowledge that he lacked. Some called him Payne the Brain. At about 10 o'clock that evening, Stefan DeFay met Payne and the twins, and the new proprietors of Hotel Organization Limited drove to Wilton Place to see their property. Everything had been legally tied up and signed. Payne didn't make mistakes. It was an interesting evening, interesting for the twins, who gazed with mounting avarice and awe as the earliest of the night's gamblers seated themselves at the rich bays of the tables and the chips began traveling. Interesting for the club's manager and principal shareholder, who was waiting to meet the night's big punters, ignorant of what had happened. Most interesting of all for Leslie Payne, who held the company minutes of Hotel Organization Limited under his arm and was waiting for a good moment to tell the manager and his co-directors that they had new partners. Payne did it very well. Nothing disturbed the ritual of the gaming room as he informed the manager that the ownership of his club had changed for good. The manager showed no emotion as he glanced at DeFay's signature and casually remarked that he would fight the legality of the deal to the last lawyer in the land. "Of course," said Payne, who always had a pleasant smile for such occasions, "by all means try," but he hardly thought that it would do much good. He had consulted the best company lawyers in London already. He looked around him at the small bar, the softly lighted gaming room, the restaurant where club members could eat well through the night, the roulette wheel in the anteroom. The place was filling fast now, and he called a waiter, ordered a bottle of champagne, told him to put it on his account, and asked his two friends what they'd like to drink. The night the twins and Payne walked into Esmeralda's barn, the club seemed heading for success. It had been quicker off the mark than any other club when the new Gaming Act legalized gambling and had maintained its lead. Croupiers were still scarce. Esmeralda's barn had the best in London. Gamblers were an unknown quantity, but the manager's personal friends, rich London restaurant owners, were the one group who played big and always met their debts. The address was perfect. This was the gold mine that the twins suddenly found they had a stake in. Payne and his lawyers soon restructured the business side of the barn. DeFay's name stayed on the directors' list for 2 more years, but he never appeared and never collected a penny. The 2 junior directors were eased out, while the manager, the mainstay of the club and the one man to have invested real money in it, stayed on with a 50% stake in the profits. Payne and the twins absorbed the rest. During the first few months, the twins made no great difference to the running of the club. For both of them, it was a new toy. They had identical dark blue dinner jackets made in Savile Row and would arrive shortly before midnight, drink, order a steak in the restaurant, then watch the money roll in. There were 3 chemi tables, each with 9 players, operating from 11 p.m. until 3 a.m. Each player paid at the rate of £3 per shoe to the house. From then to 6 a.m., shoe money rose to £6 each. After 6 a.m. it rose to £10. A good croupier takes roughly 4 minutes for a shoe. The senior croupier did it in less. Shoe money was straight profit to the house. When the twins came, the barn was drawing something over £10,000 a week from the tables. This meant that thanks to Rackman, the twins suddenly possessed assured incomes of something like £40,000 each a year, with nothing to do for them except wear dark blue dinner jackets. Just before Christmas, Reggie's appeal against conviction in the Shay case failed. Despite the efforts of his lawyers, he went back to Wandsworth for the following 6 months. Ronnie was left to make the most of wealth and Esmeralda's barn alone. He enjoyed sitting in the bar at night, knowing that people wondered who he was. He enjoyed the money. He enjoyed the sense of ownership. But there was nothing in the whole club for him to do. Had there been, he might have learned just how delicate a business big-time gambling can be. He never did learn this. He was a villain, not a bank clerk. He hated gambling and despised the rich. He was incapable of sitting back and accepting £800 a week for doing nothing. For Ronnie, there was something wrong with money that was not dishonestly acquired. He had to have a racket of his own. Not for the money, he had more than enough. But racketeering was a habit and a way of life. He could feel superior to those he cheated. Soon he was nipping the cashier for small amounts and fleecing the occasional client. Then he found something neater. It was exactly what he wanted, since it enhanced his sense of private power. Like any gambling club, Esmeralda's barn was obliged to pay winnings straight away and bear any losers' checks that bounced. Success depended on keeping the margin of dud losers' checks to a minimum. The manager was extremely strict over the credit he would grant within the club. Ronnie was different. Whenever the manager was away or off duty, Ronnie as a director had the right to say who should have credit. He began granting it quite freely, seeing that it placed the gambler firmly in his debt. If the man won, Ronnie had done him a favor and would expect a good commission in return. If he lost, the house might have to carry the bad check. Ronnie would settle privately for whatever he could recover. Provided Ronnie could scare the man into paying him a few pounds, he would be satisfied. The manager soon saw what was happening when checks marked return to drawer flooded the office. When they came to over £2,000 in 1 week, he mentioned it to Ronnie. Ronnie laughed. Why should the manager worry when there was more play than ever across the tables? The manager tried explaining that no club could carry such losses. As a last gesture, he offered the twins £1,000 a week to stay away. Reggie was still in Wandsworth. Ronnie replied that they weren't interested. So the manager, good gambler that he was, saw that the time had come to cut his losses, forget the money he had invested in the club and place his bets elsewhere. He was scrupulously polite to Ronnie. He could afford to be. When he set up his new club in Curzon Street, his richest clients followed him. The checks no longer bounced. Today his club remains what Esmeralda's barn would have been, one of the 4 top gambling clubs in London. The twins could still have had a permanent share of the profits. At the time, nobody worried. If the manager left, so much the better. His share of profit could now go to Leslie Payne and the twins. They had to bring a new manager in to run the gambling, but he had no say over credit. If something like £15,000 of bad checks piled up in the cashier's office during the 6 months, who cared? Play was increasing all the time. What Ronnie really wanted was a plushier version of the billiard hall, a headquarters where he could come on show with his following and be himself before an audience. This seemed impossible at first. Everybody in the barn appeared so confident and rich, but Ronnie despised them. There's such a lot of crybabies, frightened of what their old man will say when he finds out what they've been up to. So when they're in a mess they come crawling. They'll do anything then to save themselves, even pretend to like you. But they're not sincere like East End people. When it comes to it, they always let you know your place. The chip on his shoulder showed. The urge to humiliate was irresistible. One of the barn's most regular losers was a deadbeat peer. Ronnie knew he was on the edge of bankruptcy, but always gave him credit to play. When he had lost again, the old man would ring him up at Valence Road and threaten suicide. Ronnie enjoyed this and would say, "All right, you silly old bastard. Don't waste the gas by putting your head in the oven today. You can't afford it. Come round to Valence Road when I've had my shave and I'll see what I can do. Don't be late." The clientele was changing as the dedicated, big-time gamblers started to keep away. Now came the playboy gamblers, gambling addicts, chancers, and the chronically in debt, people the manager would have headed off. Ronnie welcomed them. If they got deeper into debt, so much the better. The house could carry them, and this would mean more people under his control. Violence crept in. Several drunken losers at the barn were thrown down the stairs, and occasionally Ronnie instructed East End villains to call on members he considered cheeky about their debts. What happened then was not his business. If somebody was hurt, an empty flat smashed up, this had nothing to do with him. But on the whole, Ronnie knew better than to use violence to get back money that he was owed. This wasn't what he wanted. Money meant nothing. He wanted power and status. There was a sort of devious flirtation in the way he played those who feared him, smiling one night, meeting them with a blank stare and a demand for money the next. He began getting what he seemed to want, the pretense of friendship, the appearance of respect, even of social success. These were people who could introduce him to the smart life if he wanted it. They took him to their homes, their London clubs, dined him in the House of Lords, introduced him to celebrities. It was surprising how cheap the rich world was, and it gave Ronnie a new role, the playboy gangster in a sophisticated world. As usual, he began dressing for the part, sharper suits, heavier jewelry, better cut overcoats. Then he moved into the West End, taking the lease on a top-floor Chelsea flat in payment for a gambling debt. He took the whole place over. Furniture, pictures, the former tenant's young boyfriend. Then for a while, he became something of a character on the Chelsea scene, the King's Road's own gangster in residence. He was the showman once again, conscious of his public. Sometimes he played the heavy gangster, sometimes the clown. One night he brought a chimpanzee in evening dress into the barn, sat him down at the tables and had him paid his winnings. Another night, when things were dull, he announced that he was marrying one of the girls in the club. This was a novelty at least. Like everything with Ronnie, it had to be done at once. Payne suggested holding the marriage aboard ship. He knew somebody with a boat moored off Chelsea Reach. It was 2 a.m., but the man was fetched, guests summoned. Payne was appointed best man. The wedding party started. It was a great affair. Word soon got around that there was free champagne at Esmeralda's barn. Ronnie was suddenly in earnest, drinking toasts and talking about the children he would have. The one thing he refused to do was kiss the bride. Not that this mattered. Long before dawn broke, Ronnie was slumbering quietly on a couch at the far end of the restaurant, the girl on one side and the man who was to have married them on the other. They woke up with the cleaners. Despite a joke like this and an occasional experiment, Ronnie disliked women more than ever. Now that he was out of the East End, he made no bones about his homosexuality. It was a relief to be able to admit it. Now he discovered its advantages. It was quite smart, a sort of eccentricity to be made the most of, and he now had an entree to the useful Freemasonry of the similarly inclined. There was no hint of effeminacy about him. "I'm not a puff, I'm homosexual," he would say, and was genuinely put out by the antics of effeminate males. "Pansies," he used to say, with the same cockney contempt with which he pronounced the word women. He liked boys, preferably with long lashes and a certain melting look round the eyes. He particularly enjoyed them if they had had no experience of men before. He liked teaching them and often gave them a fiver to take their girlfriends out on condition they slept with him the following night. He always asked them which they had preferred. He was something of a sadist, but was generous with his lovers. The gifts he gave them were his main extravagance. He never seems to have forced anyone into bed against his will and, as he proudly insisted, was free from color prejudice, having tried Scandinavians, Latins, Anglo-Saxons, Arabs, Negroes, Chinese, and a Tahitian. An important part of the compulsive pederasty which had begun to dominate his life was his growing fear of the dark. He dreaded sleeping alone. During this period at the barn, he fell in love. This was not something he approved of. Love, especially when combined with sex, was usually a means women employed to keep men at home and relieve them of their money. So it might be more exact to say that Ronnie began living with a boy on a regular basis and permitted himself the luxury of continued tenderness for the first time in his life.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.